All right, hey everyone, this is Ash. Welcome back to the King's Speech. So it's finally time for me to talk about Yamato and to a lesser extent Kiku as well, and their potential arcs and identities. The potential arcs and how their identities will play into that, and all thoughts therein. I've been meaning to get this out for a while, but uh, there was just been a lot of topics I wanted to cover and address in this video specifically. So that's why it took so long for me to get it out. So I really hope that this covers a lot of the nuances and complexities inherent in the topic. Uh, so I hope it covered all the nuances and complexities as best as I could. So yeah, before we dive into the video proper, just a few caveats and disclaimers as always. So the first one, possibly the biggest one for this video specifically, is the acknowledgement that I am a cisgender hetero man. And so if you feel like, taking my thoughts on this topic with a grain of salt, that is perfectly and completely understandable because I know what the optics of that look like. But that said, the reason I even considered and even doing this video in the first place is that I'm not going to be talking about anything particularly radical or revolutionary with regards to LGBT representation, especially transgender representation in media, like all the pitfalls associated with that. This all just really basic stuff that I'm gonna be covering. And the biggest reason I'm doing this is because I want to use my privilege to broach these topics and kind of redirect harassment away from the LGBT community. Because the thing is that as much as fans of One Piece would like to believe, that the series' messages on acceptance and diversity and inclusion and equality, etc., all that good stuff, are overt and universal and really really plain for anyone reading the series to see. There's still a lot of hate and bigotry entrenched in the fandom, and having been on the receiving end of that for quite a while, when I started becoming more vocally critical of the series, I know how toxic and harmful it can be to your someone's mental health when you're trying to advocate for better representation and or criticize the representation you do see in series like this, and how much it's permeated the media. And so I really wanted to do what I can to lessen that impact uh, on anyone that is part of that demographic, while still broaching important topics that I feel like need to be discussed within the fandom itself. And so, that said, I definitely do not want to speak out, nor is my intention to speak out or over, actual transgender or other LGBT fans and, tell them how they should be feeling or how their experience with the series should be like or anything like that. So if there is anything in this video, someone from the demographic feels like is either harmful or incorrect, then please let me know either in the comments below or if you want to just send it in private through my Twitter DMs. They're always open. Then please feel free to let me know, and I will issue any and all corrections as needed right away, just to correct for that. That said, I did my best to make sure there would be none of that in this video, but things always do kind of slip through the cracks. So if there is anything like that, please do let me know. Don't be afraid to approach me or think I'm going to be there's going to be backlash or anything about that. That's not going to be an issue at all. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about this later in the video. But let me acknowledge up front that yes, I am going to be making certain assumptions in this discussion regarding Yamato's gender identity. And I know that we have not got the full backstory on what his deal is, what shape his arc will take, what story Oda's trying to tell with him specifically, and how it's going to all end and kind of tie together. And so maybe a bit of this is premature for me to have this discussion and talk about it. But that said, there's a certain prominent person in the One Piece fandom. I'm not going to outright name them, just because I do not want to start a whole thing just because of their influence and their reach and everything else on various platforms. But I think most of you will probably be able to figure out who exactly I'm talking about, uh, because they're well connected in the fandom in an official capacity. And I want to talk about how specifically they've been saying things like, you can use whatever pronouns you want to refer to Yamato, or oh, you can headcanon their gender however you like, things in that vein. And I want to get into that a little bit because I don't like it when people are trying to appease bigots or pretend that they're being, neutral or not political, that they're not like pushing their expectations onto other people or telling them how to think, like all that different kind of crap. And I really hate it when people pretend like that's not what they're doing when they try to take these kinds of stances. And so, I want to talk about that specifically, but that'll happen later in the video. I just wanted to mention that up front here because it really annoyed me when I saw those discussions coming across my Twitter feed. And the last little point before we start is that despite my critical stance on One Piece, a lot of you are probably familiar with my opinions on the series at this point. This is not really an assassination video. I know some people will take it that way. I know a lot of people already dismiss my opinions on things because they feel like, I have a personal vendetta against Oda and I'm too biased to provide any objective commentary, which is something I do not have time to get into right now. But rest assured, I'm not out here trying to discredit Oda, or paint him as a bigot undeservedly, or, I'm not trying to be, negative for the sake of being negative. I want to talk about, I want to stress this point, especially that acknowledgement does not equal understanding. Like, you can acknowledge that One Piece has serious flaws in its representation, and you can still like the work in spite of that, in spite of its shortcomings. But if I'm being honest, I feel like a large majority of the fandom don't really understand why certain aspects of the series are problematic and all the nuances kind of surrounding that, or the overlook or downplay it because it makes them feel uncomfortable. That's probably like a topic for another video completely. But the main like crux of what I'm trying to get across with this is that I don't want anyone that's watching this to kind of dismiss what I'm saying out of hand and to really, give it a chance, listen to what I'm saying. And I will admit it sucks that I, have to use these disclaimers in all these videos that I do and talk about it. But it needs to be said that, do not go down the route of thinking not all fans, when I'm talking about a certain subject in this. Because by this point, everyone should know why it's dumb to kind of think, oh, well, not all fans are bigots. Not all fans, read the series this way. Not all fans, will misgender these characters or do this, etc., stuff like that. Or, not all fans are like, but just this idea that, is just a silent, or not a silent, a vocal minority of the fandom is, the ones that hold these bigoted and stereotypical and harmful views, and a large majority are not like that. I think that's the kind of thing I need to fight back against with this. So I just wanted to put that out there as well. So yeah, with that all said, let's dive into the video proper. Quick note before I forget, before we dive into this further. But I'm probably gonna have to split this video into two separate parts just because there is so much I want to cover and so many topics I want to approach and talk about. So part one will cover my initial thoughts, speculations around Yamato and Kiku and their introductions, as well as my thoughts on the other fan base's reaction to them. And part two will be the dive into Oda's history with representation in the series and a little bit more of the analytical aspects of like, all right, what's he done? What problematic stereotypes has he played into unintentionally or not? You know, all that kind of stuff will be part two of the discussion. But yeah, I want to put it out that I want to be splitting this into two just because I don't want to make this video overly long, kind of have people zone out too early. So with all that said, diving into the stuff proper. So let me start with my personal feelings on the Yamato and Okiku reveal, which is basically equal parts optimism, apprehension, and suspicion. Optimism because let's be real here that despite how much One Piece fans like to proclaim, this series is for everyone, everyone can find someone that they can relate to or are represented by and all that in the series, that's not really the case. Like, especially when it comes to representation. And it's not really a great sign that almost every fan, when you're talking about LGBT representation specifically, will kind of default to Eva and Bond being, the kind of prime examples of representation done well and characters that they love, that are part of that demographic. Uh, partly because they have their own shortcomings. And disclaimer that this does not mean that I expect these characters to be perfect and not be perfect representations without any flaws, any of that kind of stuff. It's not what I mean. But also because out of a cast of hundreds of characters in the series, fans can only really point to two LGBT characters that aren't outright one-dimensional caricatures, or horrific stereotypes of like, the typical, what is it, the men in dresses, which most of the ones on Peachy Kingdom are, but that'll be the discussion saved for the part two video. And again, it's not really a good sign that I've seen people talk about how whenever they do recommend this series to a friend, that is part of that demographic, that they have to include a list of caveats about the problematic representation from Oda in the series, just so their friends aren't like blindsided by it when they do get to that point and they see, all the horrible jokes and Sanji's overt bigotry and stuff like that. So, it isn't great that if you have to say, a series is for everyone, but then add a bunch of caveats and disclaimers about how certain groups are represented, then, that I don't understand the disconnect and how that happens like that. But like I said, that's not really the discussion for this video. So back to Kiku Yamato. So when Oda, did introduce two transgender characters that weren't horrifically terrible, like one-dimensional caricatures or stereotypes, I can see why it's a cause for celebration. And I utterly and truly do hope, as well as, as do all my friends and mutuals, that this really is finally representing a turnaround for Oda's shitty representation and the end of Sanji's bigotry, thus far in the series. And I really want to emphasize that the second one is vitally important to this because slightly better representation doesn't mean shit if Sanji's bigoted, behavior continues to be normalized and Oda continues to crack jokes about it. That doesn't really make things better. It doesn't really represent a turnaround for it. So if this really is, the signal of something like Oda's fundamentally changing his attitudes and behaviors and representations of LGBT people and transgender people, Sanji's bigotry just needs to be like completely eliminated, and Oda can just pretend like never bring it back, never address it, and that will be great. Like that will be a really good sign that Oda is turning around how he does this. But I'll have to wait and see, because Oda's track record really does speak for itself. Hence the second emotion which I felt, which was the apprehension. Because again, it's not a great sign that a majority of the fandom were scared of what would happen if Shitji, oh my god, we'd have to talk about that asshole later on, finds out, what would have happened if Shitji found out that Okiku was a transgender woman. Especially given how much more incelish he's been acting around her and the other women in Wano, where he's getting so jealous and angry that she was getting so much closer to Kinemon because Kinemon is her friend. They're almost like family. And he's getting so jealous and mad, being like, "Oh my god, what does that guy have that I don't have? Like, oh, why aren't you paying attention to me?" Like, all that was really, really creepy. And I don't want to imagine what direction the jokes surrounding that could have been taken if Sanji found out she was a transgender woman and he starts acting like, how he would potentially be acting. And it kind of sucks that so many people kind of sighing in relief because it looked like Oda glossed over any potential interactions between them when the Straw Hats and the Scalvards, do the planning for the raid and everything else. And we didn't have to see, another display of his outright bigoted behavior and like his shitty behavior. And the thing that sucks even more than all of that is I deliberately said for now because I cannot discount the idea of Oda making a joke about this at some point in the future. And it really makes me so mad because I've seen, transgender friends or mutuals talking about how much Oda's hurt them before, how badly they've been burnt by this series despite how much it has meant to them and like how much they've connected to it and its themes and its messages and everything else. And how they're not sure if they can take another betrayal by him, if he does something that is horribly bigoted or disgusting with a transgender character in the future, or just reactions to them. And it makes me so fucking mad that they have to worry about crap like that from the series. And with Yamato's introduction, Oda kind of just amplified all that apprehension that I'm feeling because it really was a showcase of how little he seems to understand transgender identities and issues and like the problems surrounding all of it. But I'll hold off on diving on specifics of that until we cover like a little bit of the other stuff first. Which brings me kind of to the last emotion I felt, and that was suspicion. And I know that's kind of a weird one to talk about, be like, why would you be suspicious about him introducing two characters like this? So let me preface by saying that no story ever needs an explanation for a character's gender identity or sexuality. And this is something that bugs me personally because I react to a lot of series on my channel. And a lot of them do have LGBT representation. And I get so many shitty comments either on my YouTube videos or sent anonymously to me through my Curious Cat account, where people, try to sea line me talking about, oh, why does this series have a gay agenda? And I fucking hate it when people send me dumb shit like that. And I want to I want to point out and outright state that stories with LGBT characters do not need to be about exploring their gender identity or their struggles, nor should it be, the defining feature of their story or their narrative arcs. Their stories really can and should just be about them existing and their gender identity or sexuality, just being an aspect of them and not the only trait about them, you know, and it's just a part of their identity that isn't like it's part of their identity, but it's not the dominant aspect of their identity, if that makes sense. And that's something I firmly, firmly believe in. But that said, I can't deny that those were the first thoughts that came to my head when seeing both Okiku and Yamato. Because of how little representation we have had in the series and how badly Oda's fumbled it up to this point, I had to wonder what agenda he had in mind for these characters and how much their gender identity would factor into their arcs, insofar as they had one. And I know I'm not the only one in this because I've talked to other fans as well who have also been kind of suspicious and been speculating on, what was potentially might be happening behind the scenes with Oda. Did someone have a talk with him about this, about getting better representation? Did someone say they had issues with how he's been doing this? Was someone asking him to do more, better representation? Like, was there some kind of secret push behind the scenes that we had not seen happening? Because a lot of people seem to be like taken aback by the fact that, hey, we're getting transgender characters that aren't like, stereotypes. Like, what's happening? Like, is Oda okay? And it's not a particularly good sign that, so many fans are suspicious of Oda's motive, because to me, more than anything, that speaks for the quality of his past representation, and that fans are so hard pressed to believe that, he's genuinely changed for the better. And like, maybe he has, and like I mentioned above, maybe it is too early to pass judgment. But, and this is the part I need to do a little bit of a digression before I get any further into this, and say that like, as much as I want to hope that Oda has gotten better, I don't want to keep crapping on what he's done and kind of, not not give him the benefit that I'll think the props for potentially doing better. I also want fans to stop kind of overly praising him for the little that he has done so far. Because, I understand that fans are excited and you want to hope for the best. You want to hope that Oda's learning and doing better and learning how to be a better ally and all that stuff. So you don't have to keep, talking about all the ways to see, like, you don't have to add those caveats when you're recommending this series. But that doesn't mean you should just effusively praise him for doing the bare minimum, or just completely give him the benefit of the doubt. Give him a free pass and be like, oh, I'm sure he's going to do better. This is representing a turnaround, like all that stuff. Like, as it's kind of like something I struggle with. Like, yeah, it's too early to think swing either way. But we'll get into that discussion a little bit later in this video. But another specific point, especially I want to talk about, like, the fandom response to this, is I get that part of the whole, when fans are talking about how Kaido affirms his son's gender, and Luffy says fuck transphobes, tweets and stuff that have been going around. I understand how that basically is about fighting back against, bigots being bigots, as they're wont to do, and kind of trying to talk about the series kind of central theme of acceptance, equality, and all that stuff. But we have to be critical of Oda's work if we're ever going to get better representation and truly combat, bigotry and ignorance. And having Oda do the bare minimum of, oh well, these characters affirm this person's gender identity. Oh, these Straw Hats are not overtly transphobic or bigoted towards these characters. That really is the bare minimum when Oda then turns around, misgenders characters, has one of the main good guys, be an overt transphobe, constantly makes jokes about normalizing bigotry and stuff like that. We can't ignore one just because we don't like it and talk about, the stuff we do want to talk about and we see as a more positive kind of shift in it. So I just want people to be more aware. Like, I'm not saying don't celebrate these moments and don't push back against, bigoted behavior. But again, don't, give Oda too much credit for what he's doing when he's really doing below the bare minimum. So with all that said, let's dive into some personal theories and speculation and talk about how Oda could potentially approach these two characters' arcs in a positive way, and put out positive representation. And I want to use this to talk specifically about another potentially suspected transgender character and how their narrative may tie into Yamato and Okiku's, if at all. And yeah, so talk about how Oda may have potentially set up some kind of, foreshadowing setup for this reveal. So I'm of course talking about Sir Crocodile. I think everyone should have guessed that by this point. And for anyone that is unfamiliar with said theories, which I highly doubt, given how pervasive they are, back in Impel Down, it was revealed that Crocodile had some history with Ivankov, with the latter holding some kind of secret or weakness over Crocodile's head, to get him to cooperate in the jailbreak. Make sure he wasn't going to do any backstabbing and all that kind of stuff. And earlier in the arc, we had seen that Eva would forcibly transition a person using his hormone powers. I'll talk about that's probably going to be part of the next video where I'll talk about the problematic aspect of that. And that's kind of where the Croc is transgender theories and all Croc is Luffy's mom, which has become so overdone as a joke. Like, I don't think I've ever tired of a joke as quickly as I've tired of this one. Not because it's problematic or anything, but just because of how overused it's become at this point. But that's where like all these theories and ideas kind of abounded from. And Oda really kind of added fuel to the fire with this, because in chapter 0, which was the one I think was like the one leading up to Strong World, was like the whole Shiki backstory of how he escaped from Impel Down. Oda showed a bunch of the former warlords while witnessing Roger's execution. So he showed Moria, Mihawk, Doflamingo, and Crocodile. Back in their prime days for some of them, at Roger's execution. And Crocodile was the only one who Oda made sure to kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Oda basically had Croc's back turned to us, so we couldn't make out his facial features at the time. We only saw his slick back hair, smoking the cigar, and everything else. And you could argue that maybe he did this to hide whether or not Croc had his signature kind of facial scar at this point in the series timeline. But given that he showed Prime Moria, who also at that point did not have his, a little ribbony scars coming down his neck, and he looked vastly different. Because he looked so vastly different, I really doubt that Oda would show Prime Moria and decide not to show Prime Crocodile if he didn't have a scar at that point, and to be deliberately vague about it just for that. And then to add even more fuel to it, when the Beaver Card data books were released, Crocodile's data specifically alluded to and included a gender bent pic that Oda had drawn of all the warlords when they were gender bent. And I think it added a comment of something along the lines of like, oh, he would have the same energy as a woman as a man, or something like that. So this is all kind of added fuel to the fires of this theory that Croc is a transgender man. And at some point, he went to see Ivankov so that he could transition. And so I want to talk about that. So let's say that Croc's secret is that he is transgender. What then? Like, if what if that is the secret or weakness that Ivankov is been holding over his head to kind of force him to cooperate? And the thing is, like, Croc being ashamed of being transgender or having transition isn't inherently a terrible storyline. As it could discuss themes and issues like, internalized transphobia, bigotry, societal expectations, gender norms, things like that. Because as progressive as, the Straw Hats and their allies and everyone else are, there is still a lot of racism, prejudice, things like that exist in the One Piece world. So if Oda really wanted to, he could really explore a lot of these topics, and tie it back to real world issues with, how trans people are regarded and treated in the real world. He could kind of mirror those issues in the One Piece world. So I'm not ruling out the idea that that could be a potentially good storyline to kind of discuss and go through. And this is something, I've personally theorized about myself as well. But that said, I don't think Oda has the range, or at least he hasn't shown that he has the range, or he's even done the research to be able to do such a storyline justice. And if I'm being honest, I kind of land firmly in the camp of no representation is better than half-assed representation or problematic representation, because honestly I feel like it takes twice the amount of work to undo the harm done by the latter. Even if it means that it's harder to get stories with proper representation published because people will go, there's no demand for it, etc., whatever. And especially given the size of Oda's platform and the opportunity it provides to do harm and propagate and perpetuate harmful myths and stereotypes. He's already done damage, and I don't want him to do more in this series. So, that said, I can't really stop him from going ahead with a potential storyline like that or exploring these issues, uh, no matter how ill advised. So all I can really do is kind of talk about how he can and should approach it, and what missteps he's already committed, just so other people are aware, other fans are aware of what to look for, and what to be aware of when you're kind of looking at stories like this to understand what representation looks like, stuff like that. So how could all these character arcs tie together or be approached? So first, a brief kind of digression before we talk about this is a potential path Oda could take that is probably going to be the least harmful, and to be quite honest, is probably the ideal one I think a lot of fans would like to see, is that Oda has introduced two transgender characters just because, and their gender identity really is just an aspect of their character, and Oda does not explore it in any way, shape, or form. And I think this would be ideal for fans because it gives them an opportunity, to kind of create fan fiction and headcanons of two canon transgender characters without the messiness of Oda exploring topics he doesn't have enough knowledge of, and therefore, he can't fuck it up or further propagate and perpetuate harmful stereotypes. And it kind of gives a lot more freedom to the fans to kind of make up their own stories, kind of push for what kind of representation or stories they would like to see these characters get, rather than Oda kind of trying to do his own thing with that. And along with this, like I said before, having Sanji's transphobia just disappear without it ever being addressed or brought up, like what happened to it, just forget that this was an aspect of his character, just move along. And I feel like this is the ideal situation. And to be honest, I think this is the one most fans would like. That said, how likely is it? It's too early to tell at this point. There's far too many moving pieces in Wano right now for me to say anything definitive. But I just wanted to point to this as a potential scenario. And honestly, at this point, it might be more likely than the other ideas I'm going to present just because we are so far into this arc and we are at the seeming climax. So if everyone's right, and if the editors are talking about how the arc is going to be wrapping up soon, we're getting into like the final arcs of the story. So if everyone is right, we are pushing to the end of Wano. That could potentially mean this scenario is more likely, but again, it is way too early to tell. But on the other hand, so what if Oda decides to explore it? How would he, and can he even do anything with it at this point? And here's the thing about that. For the longest time, like this is the confession I have to make, is for the longest time, I speculated that Oda could potentially explore Croc's backstory, assuming his secret is related to him potentially being transgender and like issues he has with gender identity and things like that. And I felt like he potentially would do that on Wano because he has history with Whitebeard, and Whitebeard has strong connections to Wano. Uh, I speculated about this first when Weevil was introduced, and I don't think at that point I even knew like how much exactly Whitebeard would be tied to Wano with his connections to Oden and everything else. But I've had this idea since about that point. And B, like many other fans, I also felt like since Wano is seemingly a very conservative society, what with it being based on feudal Japan and everything like that, with a seemingly rigid and outdated idea of gender norms and societal expectations related to that, it would be the perfect arc for Oda to kind of criticize said norms and the expectations and burdens it faces on people. Especially since this was something I'll probably eventually talk about when I do an Oden video, but especially because it seemed like an aspect that Oda was gearing up to explore that he never really kind of addressed in Oden's backstory, was how a lot of his vassals and even Oden himself were basically kind of like cultural black sheep in which they don't really adhere to societal norms and expectations for the most part of what they expect of samurai, what they expect of a lord, things like that. So it felt like Oda was potentially dropping hints about potentially exploring these ideas and themes in Wano. And again, like bringing in gender identity into that would have been another really cool aspect to kind of explore in this arc specifically. But I have to kind of emphasize, the point being that there is an opportunity to explore all these ideas. But that said, we're 70 plus chapters into this arc. And like I mentioned, we're at the seeming climax with the raid fully underway. The conflict with Kaido seemingly coming to a head. And Oda hasn't really explored any of the aforementioned, nor has he really laid any of the groundwork for it to be explored, as a hanging thread that needs to be wrapped up before this arc ends. And I think more than anything, this is one of the biggest criticisms I have of Wano as an arc overall. And that's how muddled it is. Like, don't get me wrong, like the arc has a lot of intriguing ideas. I'm eventually going to want to talk about the caste system and Oden's backstory at some point in a future video. But he hasn't really done anything with them. Like thus far, he's kind of recycled the half-assed theme of like, oh, food is important, everyone should be able to feed and things. And like, yeah, I mean, it's a good theme. It's a strong theme. Like, yeah, it applies to Wano. It's built some good emotional connections to certain characters. but it's also one that he's kind of used liberally before, and it isn't really very specific to Wano or its people or its situation, as much as the other themes, such as a caste system, are. And so, and and the other one before I forget is like also the one of like the opening the borders. Like the Scabbards keep repeatedly talking about the need to open the borders. No one's like, oh, we need to open the borders. We need to open Wano up. We need to do this. But there's no substance to any of it. There's no exploration of like why they need to do like what the reasoning behind it is. What his eventual goals. And I know part of it's just being like, oh, that's just the way Oda is. He wants to build this mystery and intrigue because he wants to eventually address it at some point. But it really has hurt a lot of his story. So like coming back to the main point of like the gender identity stuff. So if Oda is planning to address gender identity in some way, shape, or form that isn't extremely superficial, then he'll either need to pack it in really quickly at some point soon to make it believable, or like I mentioned above, it'll just be something that he just kind of shunts off and he just never really explores, kind of just a dropped idea, that he never explored because of time, what other restraints, what have you. But like I said, if he did want to do it at this point, is there a way he could do it? The easiest way I think for him to do something like that is something I've talked about and addressed in a previous video, and that's what I've kind of dubbed the mask theme. It's kind of too long, didn't read it, kind of summarize it as best as I can. Shinobu, back when Yasuo was getting executed, Shinobu mentioned that the people of Bisu, because of the effects of the smile fruit, were wearing, masks that they cannot remove for the rest of their lives. And, and when we first learned that Okiku is a transgender woman, the way it plays out was with Hyogoro telling the Scabbards, unmask yourselves and show everyone who you are to the prisoners of the Udon mine. And you see all of them kind of taking off like the scarves and everything used to hide their faces, except for Kiku, who puts a mask on. And to date, that is still one of my favorite, panels and moments in Wano. And this was the prime reason I immediately suspected Oda might have done something similar for Yamato. With the reveal that Yamato is potentially transmasculine, is because he was also initially introduced wearing a Hanya mask, and I'm like, all right, at this point, this cannot be a coincidence. And I'll admit that I'm excited by this idea of the mask theme as a way to explore the concept of identity and performance, of being true to oneself and of playing the role expected of you in society and how people perceive you, and how people perceive the front you put on when you interact with them versus the true you that's inside, and things like that. And with the abuse of citizens, the aspect of the agency and have it being taken away from you, the point you cannot express your true emotions and true self because you're limited by these external forces, and you're being kind of you're basically like oppressed, and at some point the expectation being that they're going to be liberated from these shackles, from these restraints. That was not good. That was not a good example to use. But to basically be liberated and be able to express themselves truly and freely. So like this is something I've talked about a lot on Twitter, but I think about Kiku putting on the mask, especially because it mirrors that of another character, and that's Hiyori. Because we see that Hiyori, whenever she's playing the shamisen for Orochi, always wore a kitsune mask whenever she played it. Because I'm not sure if we got this as a confirmation or not, but I think we found out that this because she plays the song, that she plays for Oden, for her father, And he's like, oh, one day you'll have to play for my funeral, and she cries and all that crap, right? And so I always kind of suspected that the reason she wears that mask when she plays that song is because she is crying behind the mask, but she doesn't want people to see that she's getting emotional. So that's why she kind of masks herself so she can mask her true emotions and things like that. And that's instantly the same way I felt about Kiku, i.e., she's either crying or sad behind the mask because we see how the random Wano people, were misgendering her and possibly dead naming her, which is a discussion I'll get to later in the video as well. And how that might also tie into the Hanya mask symbolism of how at certain angles, the demon face looks sad, melancholic. It represents, like an angry or scorned woman, things like that. I'm getting excited just talking about the possibilities of, this theme coming to the forefront, being explored. But like I said, there hasn't really been any further development of this aspect by Oda. Like he hasn't even referenced it, or hinted at it being explored in some way. And so, unless there's an unexpected twist in Wano, which I'm still kind of thinking there's going to be more to it than Oda's letting on right now, then there's no reason, to kind of suspect he'll deliver on it in any way when there's no evidence to the contrary. And like I said above, Oda doesn't need, to explore gender identity or the issues surrounding it in the story. But fans do need to stop giving him the credit for doing the absolute minimum thus far. And there's really two key issues that kind of irk me with regards to this. And the first is the trend of fans claiming that Luffy's rallying against transphobia by acknowledging Yamato's gender identity and pronouns and affirming them. And while I understand the sentiment behind it, I understand why people love it, I understand the appeal, I don't think we should be so jubilantly celebrating, a fictional cis ally character kind of affirming and accepting another person's gender identity. And there's been a lot of conversations I've seen fans going, I'm gonna wait and see how Luffy refers to Yamato because Yamato represents the reader, and so how Luffy refers to them is how we should be referring to them, before deciding which pronouns to use to refer to him, or I headcanon Yamato as X, and so I'm going to use these pronouns, and the fact that fans that see themselves as allies don't see how problematic that it is that they're saying that they're going to rely on someone else saying what pronouns they're going to use to kind of affirm a character who says, who's referred to themselves as being a man, who says, I use, he, him pronouns, whatever. Or instead saying, no, I'm not going to listen to that character. I'm going to listen to the other one instead. Because if Yamato says he's a man and if he uses masculine pronouns to refer to himself, especially with the former, like, it doesn't matter why Yamato says he's a man. It doesn't matter that he's saying, oh, I'm a man because Kozuki Oden was a man, and therefore because I'm Kozuki Oden, I should be a man. That shouldn't really matter for people to be like, oh, well, oh, is that really the case? Are they really a man? Oh, I don't know. It's so nebulous. Like, that shouldn't matter. That the fact that Yamato sees themselves as that should be the only reasons or validation or verification or whatever that someone needs as to, their identity and what pronouns to use and how to affirm them. And that really kind of factors in to the second point above of headcanoning character's identity. Because privileged people don't seem to understand the difference between someone from a marginalized identity headcanoning a character as also being of that marginalized identity versus a cis person headcanoning a marginalized identity as one that isn't. All right, because Marginalized people do that because there's such little diversity and representation and inclusion in so much mass media that sometimes the only way we can see ourselves represented or better relate to a character that we like or identify with is to project our marginalized identities onto them. So, when a potentially transgender character is introduced in a series and cis people go out of their way to diminish or invalidate that potential identity, so they can instead project kind of cis-centric ideas of gender and sexuality onto them, they're really just being assholes. They're not being, it's not a case of like, oh, I want to enjoy the story my way or whatever stupid reason they want to use. They're just being assholes. And there's a bunch of major assholes that have been outing themselves lately when talking about Yamato and how they're going to use she, her pronouns or call him waifu, etc. Because they're like, oh, we don't respect his choices. He, looks very feminine. He's got boobies, he's got long hair, he's got very soft and delicate features. He looks like a woman, therefore he must be a woman. I don't care what he says. That's how I'm going to refer to him. And while some of that is partly on them, as there are a lot of bigots in the One Piece fandom, there are also many, many, many well meaning One Piece fans that also fall into the same pitfalls, either because of a lack of knowledge of transgender identity and issues, or because of how Oda introduced Yamato, or both. So, with all of that said, we still have yet to talk about the key issues here, which is twofold. One of the score, one is of course, as I stated at the start of this video, the assumptions that fans are making about Yamato's identity, and the second is the muddled introduction Oda gave him. So let's start with the latter, which is kind of the source of so much of the confusion and debate within the One Piece fandom. Because Oda introduced Yamato with an Oda box stating, Kaido's daughter, self styled Kozuki Oden. And then when Luffy's initial reaction when Yamato takes off the mask to be like, oh, you said that, you're Kaido's son, right? Because, of course, again, Yamato has a very feminine appearance. And Yamato's like, yeah, well, Kozuki Oden was a man, right? So I am too. And so this has led to so much debate within the fandom where they're like, oh, did Oda make a mistake with the Oda box? Well, the series is about inherited will, so is Yamato saying he's a reincarnation of Oden? Is he, carrying on Oden's will literally? Is Yamato cosplaying Oden? And so on and so on and so forth. Right? And this to me is like really emblematic of the problem with not only having a cisgender hetero man attempting to portray gender identity, but also Oda's issues surrounding trying to be, unpredictable and surprising, and his tendency to kind of withhold information as a means to keep reader engagement and kind of encourage reader, debatable, pointless crap like this. Or not pointless crap. That was a bad phrase. Not pointless crap like this, but to engage in debate that ultimately he knows will be kind of pointless because he wants to, surprise reveal and keep the readers on the edge of their seats and stuff like that. And unsurprisingly, this has made it really easy for bigots to be bigots and misgender Yamato because, hey, the Oda box said daughter and Yamato's saying they're Oden, so obviously they aren't really a man, it must be cosplay or something else. And the thing that really fucking sucks about how Oda's approached Yamato is that he very easily could do exactly what the bigots suspect he will, and have Yamato's arc be about him shedding the Kozuki Oden role or whatever the hell the deal is, and proclaim that they really aren't transgender, they're just having an identity crisis or something else. It was a way for them. It was a way for Yamato to like get back at Kaido by taking on the role and identity of someone that Kaido hated, like Yamato uh, really loved and all that kind of stuff. And I cannot discount the possibility of that happening, because unintentionally or not, Oda is using turf logic and talking points, even if tangentially, by insinuating, the idea that transgender men or women are just playing dress up and that they're not really, men or women, but rather they're just pretending to be, for some sinister personal reason, self satisfaction, whatever. And even if it was a mistake, the fact that Oda misgendered Yamato, you know, a quick aside to point out that Steven, the official translator of the series, noted during one of the podcast episodes that Yamato was referred to with masculine pronouns thus far. So if Oda misgendered Yamato after very specifically using masculine pronouns to refer to them before the reveal, it kind of just shows the carelessness of how he's approaching this and how little he understands just how serious or harmful these seemingly small mistakes can be. You know, and I feel like I should address this before I get any further in that before someone comes after me with this bullshit of trying to say, like, I'm not saying that a character cannot be confused about their gender identity or exploring what exactly their identity is, and kind of discarding different ones before they find one that they feel fits them the best, that best represents them. I'm not saying that's an issue here. Like, I'm not saying stories cannot tackle those kinds of ideas, nuances, or complexities. Like, that's fine. Stories should be able to explore those ideas. But I reiterate that I don't think Oda has showcased he has the range to do the same, to address the complexity and nuances of a situation like that when he has shown such little knowledge of those issues thus far. And I think the thing that bugs me the most about all of this is that if Oda does turn around and reveal that Yamato isn't transmasculine, it would feel like he baited a lot of fans by getting their hopes and expectations up by insinuating that they're finally getting, better and more varied transgender representation, and this might potentially, showcase a shift in Oda's attitudes, and that might even potentially open the door for more, transgender representation in the series, only for him to kind of pull the rug out from under them. And it really bugs me because a certain prominent One Piece individual, well connected to the fandom, well connected to Oda and kind of the official releases and everything, kind of keeps parroting this idea of, you shouldn't get your hopes up or make assumptions or have expectations because it will inevitably lead to a disappointment. And if you just wait to see how the story plays out, you'll be so much happier because you won't have had all these expectations built up. They'll just come crashing down if things don't go your way. And honestly, a big fuck you to that, because it is only someone with privilege that has never had to fight for crumbs of representation in media could possibly say. And the fact that this person has also been pandering to bigots by talking about how, a reader can headcanon Yamato's gender however you want, and that's way more important than what Oda says or what the story tells you. All that matters is what you think, and it doesn't matter what the characters of the story say. Fuck you for trying to do the pandering and pretend like you're just being, neutral and objective. Because honestly, fans deserve better. If Oda really and truly cared and had done the research on proper transgender representation, I feel like he wouldn't have done such a piss poor job with Yamato's introduction And if there were, unintentional mistakes he made with the Oda box and everything else, I feel like he wouldn't have made those mistakes if he was being careful about how he's approaching it. Like, yeah, it's great that, Luffy affirms Yamato's gender identity and, is using the proper pronouns and everything to refer to him. But that's really not enough. That's not even the bare minimum. And we readers need to stop pretending, that it's groundbreaking or radical. Because I know the arguments like, oh, we have to give Oda props that, he's using such his large platform and his voice to kind of, represent these identities that you don't really see in a lot of manga and things. And again, like, we shouldn't be praising someone for doing the bare minimum just because the bar has been set so low for representation. Though I feel like, the crumbs we get are just like, we have to praise them just to make more authors feel like, that transgender representation is a good thing and that they should include it in their stories. I don't feel like that's something we should be fighting, or not fighting for. That's the wrong word. Not something we should be, praising and trying to appease them to kind of get them better representation for. We should be fighting to kind of just normalize these kinds of stories and these kinds of characters being included in these stories and not having that be such a big deal that they are. Not act like it's such a big deal that, readers should be expected to kind of, what's what we're looking for? Readers should be able to, like, yeah, empathize with them, relate to them in these kinds of stories. Like, it shouldn't be such a groundbreaking thing. It shouldn't be treated like it is. And as I mentioned above, like, this carelessness, or at least like the lack of awareness, also somewhat extends to Kiku and dead naming. Because the people of Wano, know Kiku as Kikunojo, the most beautiful swordsman in Wano, all that. And that's how you see a lot of transphobic fans kind of referring to Kiku, is as Kikunojo rather than Kiku or just Kiku. And I don't think it helps that the variation on the names are so similar. That isn't to say that a transgender person could not choose a name that is either a masculine or feminine version or variation of their dead name. But the fact that Oda went with something so ambiguous really seems to kind of showcase his lack of awareness or knowledge surrounding these issues. And it's kind of like another hiccup in the reasons why I don't think he's really going to explore gender identity in the way I think fans would like him to. So, I mean, if you really are pro LGBT rights and representation, or at least if you're trying to do better and improve, then you shouldn't be making it so ambiguous and therefore easy for bigots to kind of reinterpret it to suit their agenda, and be able to be so openly bigoted and about the beliefs surrounding certain characters like that. And that's why, like, being overt in these situations is better than being subtle. Like, if your series claims that it's all about equality and inclusion and diversity and all things like that, and it's so easily able to be reinterpreted by bigots, or if it's so easy for bigots to miss those messages, then you're not really doing a good of a job pushing those messages as you think you are, I think, is the big kind of takeaway I'm going to say with that. So, like, I'll reiterate that I want to be positive and hopeful and excited about these developments. I want to believe that this is signaling a shift in Oda's attitude and behavior, and that a lot of the fuck-ups we're seeing are just kind of setbacks as he's learning, and that he'll do better, going forward. But his history makes it really hard to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I hate the debate surrounding Yamato's identity because of how he's chosen to structure. Like I really, really cannot emphasize how much I hate that, how much I hate the debate that's been popping up around it. But yeah, I know that this is still in the very early stages, and despite everything, we don't know the full story. Like Yamato was literally introduced only a couple of chapters ago, and so far since his introduction, it's kind of been go 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 with his character. We haven't got Kaido's backstory yet, and I'll probably strongly tie into Yamato's backstory as well, and really what his whole deal is. So yeah, so I doubt the Wano's close to being over yet, despite being almost Dressrosa length at this point, and despite the seeming climax having come up in this last chapter. And so I'm willing to, like a small part of me is willing to wait before passing final judgment on how Otis handled this and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Oh, quick point before I wrap up. This just hit me while I was going through. I didn't want to derail it. I want to add an additional point to what I said above about how it doesn't take away anything from a cis person's representation when someone from marginalized identity kind of headcanons characters that, and that's a point I want to bring up to that is because a lot of cis people might argue that, oh, hey, if a marginalized person wants to say, oh, I headcanon this character as being black because their race was never specified, or I headcanon this character as being transgender because, I see these traits in something and I relate to them. And I know some cis people argue that, well, how come there's a double standard here? How come, marginalized people can't headcanon these characters as part of these identities, but as a cis person, I cannot do that? I want to point out that as a cis person, marginalized people headcanoning identities for fictional characters does not diminish or take away from the literal hordes of representation you as a privileged person get from literally so much mass media. So like a marginalized person just trying to say, I headcanon this character as being, trans, black, brown, Asian, whatever, doesn't diminish the value of you relating to that character. And it doesn't diminish the value you get of, how many characters you see represented in different kinds of media. Whereas it's not the same for a marginalized person where they can't just go, hey, I have literally hundreds of characters I can say I relate to whose identities and struggles and things are the same as mine. It's not the same thing. So there isn't really a double standard there. I just wanted to point that out before I'll kind of wrap this up. So I think I want to wrap this up just by saying I want fans to be critical and mindful of praising Oda as much as they do. I don't know. I want them to be critical of how Oda's work and his approach to storytelling, representation, all that, and mindful of how much you're praising him, for doing so little. And above all else, listen to, amplify, and support the voices of the marginalized fans that are expressing concerns over Oda's approach, that do criticize, how his representation in the series and how it's presented and everything like that. Because a lot of times it's easy to say, hey, well, this person thinks there's nothing wrong with, how he's approaching it, so it must be fine. I don't care what this other person says. It's like, yeah, I'm not going to take away or diminish the opinions of the person that says, hey, I myself don't have an issue with how Oda's approaching this. These things have spoken to me and I felt represented, whatever. I feel like a lot of times that leads to the fans that are critical that say, I don't feel represented. I feel like I'm not fully on board with how Oda's presenting these issues. I feel a lot of time people overlook those ones because they're going, oh, you're just being overly negative or you're being, too judgmental, whatever. I just want you all to be more receptive to those people who are more critical of the series and listen to their concerns and and listen to the merit of their concerns more so than just tone policing them and how they present it. I just want to point that out. That'll be something for another video if this one's already running a little bit long, so I don't want to get too into that. But yeah, so as I mentioned at the start, there will be a part 2 of this video. That one's going to dive more into Oda's kind of internalized bigotry and attitudes and talk about his problematic representation in the series, specifically with the Newkama, Ivankov, and everyone else. A specific issue I want to dive into with them is how Oda's kind of conflating a lot of LGBT identities under kind of the one umbrella of the Newkama and the way he's portrayed them in this series. So that's something I specifically want to talk about. But I don't have a timeline yet for when that will be out, but I'll let you know closer to the date once I have something tangible. I'm trying to think if I have any other closing thoughts on this video. No, I don't think so. Honestly, at this point, I'm just waiting to see how Oda handles Kiku and Yamato's arcs and really like how it closes out, how Wano concludes and everything else. Because right now, I will again reiterate, right now we aren't seeing the full picture, so of course things could rapidly change either for the better or for the worse. Really hoping it's for the better. We'll have to wait and see. So yeah, I think I've not rambled for long enough. So as always, if you like my content, please do like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. As always, if you disagree with anything I've said in this video, if you have any additional thoughts you'd like to add to any points I've made, if you have any counter arguments, things like that, please feel free to either drop a comment below or hit me up in my Twitter DMs, and I'm more than willing to kind of engage discussion, comment, whatever. And until next time, this is Ash. I'll talk to you all later.